tonight. She's getting her stuff together. There you can see is Marcy Darnovsky from the Center for Genetics and Society, and speaking on a case for new biopolitics. So completely different topic.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess it's redundant at a laser program to say this now for something completely different, but not for something completely different. So, okay. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what the Center for Genetics and Society is, to give you some context for the kinds of things I'm going to talk about. We're a public interest organization. We're based in Berkeley. We're not connected with UC Berkeley, however. We are looking at the social implications of human genetic and assisted reproductive technologies, and want to look at those, some very new and emerging, some applications of these technologies that have been around for some decades, but looking at them through a lens of social justice, human rights, the public interest, questions of equality and inequality. That's what we do, and the way that we do it is we have this, four-legged stool. We do the whole communications and media thing with what the websites, the social media, talking to reporters, reports, and so on. We work with a network of scholars, scientists, legal scholars, a really very multidisciplinary range of scholars, and also a range of public interest advocates in different constituencies. So reproductive rights, disability rights, human rights, environmentalists, racial justice folks, and so on. And we, when we have the capacity and the funding, we do our own research on questions that may be in need of some kind of advocacy work. And on a selective basis, it will try to weigh in on different public policy issues. And we've done that on state level, national level, and actually UN level. So what I'm going to try to do today is kind of give you a whirlwind tour. And I'm going to focus on one of the issues that we deal with, which is commercial surrogacy. And I'm doing that because I just came from a big conference on commercial surrogacy, so it's in my mind. I wanted to talk about it. But then I'll make some quick comments on these other topics: direct-to-consumer gene tests, a new kind of early pregnancy fetal gene test, DNA police databases, race and genetics, inheritable genetic modification, which is kind of the hydrogen bomb of our field. So I may not get to all of this, we'll see. Okay, so surrogacy, commercial surrogacy begins in the United States in the early 1980s, and not long after that, big scandal on the front page of all the newspapers. How many people remember the Baby M case? Yeah, so not as many as I thought maybe. But the surrogate, the woman who's working as a surrogate actually changes her mind. She's the genetic mother in this case, and goes to court and becomes headlines around the world. Commercial surrogacy continued to develop in the United States. These two images are from a New York Times Magazine front page cover story, and this was back in 2008. The woman, the intended parent, now this terminology is all really contentious, you can imagine, but I will call her the intended mother. Her name is Alex Kaczynski. You see her on the left over there holding the baby who's born, was carried and delivered by the woman on the right, the surrogate. And in the United States, unlike the situation that I think a lot of us are most concerned about, in the United States, women who are working as surrogates aren't really desperately poor. Those who are hiring them don't want to, they want to be able to be assured that the woman who's going to carry their baby is going to eat right and not smoke and do all those kind of things. So they hire women who are certainly always poorer than they are, but not desperately poor. In this case, Alex Kaczynski over there is standing at her, one of her many homes. She's married to a billionaire. She's got the nanny standing at attention. And the surrogate, you can see, has the old hound, kind of flea-bitten hound on the weathered porch. So it does illustrate that there is this question of socioeconomic inequality kind of inherent in the practice of surrogacy. The other thing that's important to know about surrogacy is that anybody can hang out a shingle and be a broker for surrogacy arrangements. And observers have said, you have to do more paperwork to open a hot dog stand than to open a surrogacy agency. And it's a problem. And it's led to, there's no, the laws about surrogacy in this country vary wildly from state to state. Most places, there's no policy, but some states explicitly prohibit it. A few states explicitly allow it. This is also true if you look at a country level among the countries. But nowhere in the United States is there any kind of licensing, regulation, oversight of surrogacy agencies. So you get these situations where people who are running these brokers disappear with the money, leaving the surrogates in mid-pregnancy, and the intended parents with their life savings, disappeared from a supposedly secure escrow account. And this has happened multiple times. And one of the really disturbing things is it happens even with people who are very prominent in the field, who are sitting on all the committees, and they're writing books, and they're appearing in the media. So on the left here is Teresa Erickson, very prominent surrogacy attorney. And a couple of years ago, she got busted by the FBI for running what the FBI called a baby selling ring. And what she was doing was sending young women who would work as surrogates over to the Ukraine, where the doctors weren't asking any questions, and they were being impregnated with anonymous sperm and embryos created from anonymous sperm and egg donors. Once the pregnancies were in their second trimester, she would tell intended parents who approached her wanting to explore the possibility of a surrogacy arrangement, oh, you are so lucky. It just so happens that we had a couple back out from a surrogacy that they had initiated. So this pregnancy is already well underway. You can have your baby in 4 months. And it'll cost you a little extra. So she was doing this over years on a repeated basis. And she spent some time in jail for it. But this was a very high profile and highly respected person in this field. The guy on the right is, I wouldn't say is highly respected. He runs an agency called Planet Hospital. And it's what some people call reproductive tourism. They make arrangements for people from largely the United States, sometimes Canada and European countries, to travel abroad. Mostly he was sending people to India. And I won't even get started. It would take far longer than 20 minutes to tell you all the kind of shady things he was doing. But just a few months ago, he finally, he had gotten himself into some kind of financial trouble apparently, and it turned out that he was stealing people's money, and one of the clients that he was ripping off turned out to be a lawyer and who investigated, and turns out that he was deceiving and swindling at least 40 people. And he's still operating the medical tourism part of Planet Hospital, but the surrogacy stuff is not on his website anymore. And the disgruntled client has turned over his documentation to the same FBI office that investigated Teresa Erickson. So, some of these things do get resolved in that criminal justice kind of way, but there's a lot of problems with the kind of Wild West policy situation that we have with commercial surrogacy, and people are getting hurt. The parents are, the surrogates are, and the children are. So we think that's a problem. Okay, not only is surrogacy happening within the United States, let's see how I'm doing on time. In the mid-2000s, some pioneering people in India decided that they were going to start this. And so surrogacy in India took off. India was a pioneer and is still a main hub. And in 2007, Oprah Winfrey talked about surrogacy on her show. And her take on it was, she said, let's see, this phenomenon of Americans going to India to hire surrogates, she's called it an example of women helping women and a confirmation of just how close our countries can be. She said the intended parents are cultural ambassadors to India and benefactors of the women who are working as surrogates. So that was her take, and it is what a lot of people believe. And you know, I mean, I'm not condemning surrogacy outright, but I'm saying there are a lot of problems with it here. So one thing to look at is the way that surrogacy is represented. And it's these very exoticized, disembodied images. This is typical. But what are conditions really like for women who are working as surrogates in India? They're not so great. In some of the places that, the clinics that operate these arrangements, women are required to leave their families. They're often recruited from very poor villages. And there's a big stigma attached to it. So if you're going to work as a surrogate in India, you don't want to tell your neighbors, and you don't want to even tell some members of your extended family. So you leave. You go to the little city that's nearby, and you live in a dormitory like this one shown here for the 9 months of your pregnancy. You're required to have had a child. That's one of the criteria for selecting a woman to work as a surrogate, because that shows you can carry a pregnancy and deliver the baby, and supposedly you have experience of it. But you're away from your children for the duration of your pregnancy. You also typically will be signing a contract in a language that you don't understand, and maybe often you don't have much literacy yourself. You are not permitted to get second medical opinions, and in many cases, you know, many aspects of your behavior are controlled, and routinely, surrogates are required to deliver their babies by cesarean section. And we've seen contracts that say that the cesarean sections are better for the mother and the baby. Well, the opposite is clearly, the opposite is true unless there's some medical indication for the cesarean section. And a lot of these women are going to go back to their villages. They're going to be far away from modern medical treatment. They're going to have subsequent pregnancies of their own. And they're going to have to deliver in the absence of modern medical care of vaginal birth after a cesarean. It's not a joke. And, you know, it's a disaster waiting to happen if it hasn't already, and we just don't know about it. So that's what surrogacy is like in India. And, you know, when you're in a bubble, when you're in a field, you think that, you know, there's been a news story and everyone knows about it. But how many people have heard of baby gammy? It's shown here. Bequeathed only. So this story was in the news over the summer. This was an Australian couple shown here who went to Thailand, where there's no policy on surrogacy, but surrogacy is emerging, an industry is taking hold. And turns out that their surrogate, shown here, was pregnant with twins. And late in the pregnancy, they learned that one of the babies had Down syndrome. So they wanted her to abort that child. She said her religious beliefs, she's a Buddhist, her religious beliefs didn't permit it. So the babies were born, and the Australian couple went to Thailand. They took home the girl and left the baby boy with Down syndrome. They abandoned the baby boy with Down syndrome, left him with the surrogate who adopted him. And this came to the attention of the news media because the baby needed heart surgery, which many Down syndrome kids do. And someone heard about it and put her on Kickstarter or one of those platforms and raised a bunch of money for the baby to have the industry. Well, so the news story took off, and then the journalists investigated and found out that this man shown here, the father, in the 80s and 90s was convicted of a string of sex offenses against children, girls as young as, I think, was 7 years old. So, you know, this is kind of shady stuff, and it's not like there are many, many situations of surrogacy that, you know, end with people feeling satisfied, happy, but there are too many stories like this. In Thailand, the authorities started getting uneasy, and people heard about this. Then it came out a few weeks after this story that there's a 24-year-old Japanese businessman who has had at least 16 babies over the last couple of years with Thai surrogates. And he says, oh, I just wanted a big family. That's being investigated. So there's story after story like this. And what it points to, from our point of view, is the need for some kind of policy, some kind of rules of the road. And indeed, there's a entity called the Hague Conference on Private International Law, which private international law means disputes that arise between people or between people and businesses, not state-to-state stuff. And they have promulgated, is the word, different conventions, including a very famous one in the mid-90s on inter-country adoption, also an area where there's been lots of problems and abuses. And they are now considering an international surrogacy convention, and a think tank organization in The Hague, with help from other organizations, including ours, put on a conference. That was the one I just went to, and there were about 100 people, scholars, advocates, policy experts, legal experts, talking about what would a convention look like. I think there was wide agreement that it would be desirable. There's not, it's not as clear that it would be feasible, so that remains to be seen. So that's what I wanted to tell you about surrogacy, and I really don't have much time left. How much time do I have left?
About 4 minutes.
About 4 minutes. So I'm just going to tell you what the issues are, rather than saying anything about them, and maybe someone will have a particular interest in one of these. We have wanted to raise questions about the reliability of direct-to-consumer gene tests, and there's been a whole policy battle about that, and whether the FDA should regulate it. The 23andMe was the most famous company that got into a kerfuffle with the FDA last year. Some direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies are selling tests for things like athletic assessment, and some of them want to sell it for athletic assessment for your toddler to tell you what kind of sport he or she should be channeled into. And then you have these things like the My Gene Profile product that's going to tell you about your baby's inborn talent based on some genetic sequencing. And these are sort of silly things that are being marketed, and it's a kind of hyperbole that we think is, bad for the public interest, and frankly bad for science, because it makes kinds of unrealistic expectations and just really degrades public understanding of what human genetics science, where it's at and what it can do. Some of these tests are also being used now in a new kind of prenatal testing, where at about 10 weeks pregnancy, circulating fetal cell-free DNA can be extracted from maternal blood and analyzed. You can get a complete genetic sequence on your fetus at 10 weeks, and so you can imagine the kinds of issues that raises. All these issues, all these technologies are kind of like dual use in a sense when you analyze them through a social justice and public interest lens. DNA forensics is a really useful tool. It exonerates people who've been falsely convicted, and it helps convict people bad guys who should be in jail. But now that these massive police databases are being built, there are also serious issues that have come up in many, many states and countries now. If you get pulled down to the police station, not even charged, let alone convicted, the police can, in some cases, are mandated to take your DNA, take the buccal swab, and it could stay in the database effectively forever. And then they're going to do these sweeps of the database, searches for cold hits, and the algorithms for what constitutes unique DNA are really in question. There's all kinds of contamination issues, problems. And then I mentioned inheritable genetic modification. This is the sort of designer baby scenario that the movie Gattaca portrayed. And here you have the real issue of the genetic haves and have-nots, the genetic castes. And unfortunately, this is a scenario that some genetic scientists think is a good idea, and we think is a terrible idea. And whereas so many of the other things that we've talked about, there's lots and lots of gray areas. It's hard to figure out. I mean, it's clear that there needs to be policy, but the lines are not so sharp. Here, in our opinion, the line is sharp, that genetic changes that we would pass down to future generations should be off the table. And in fact, there are already more than 40 countries that have codified that assumption into law, but the United States has not. And it's a live issue, with some figures, geneticists, synthetic biologists, making, I think, reckless and sometimes just media-seeking statements about how wouldn't it be great if we could have our children be smaller in size to reduce our carbon footprint, or lots of things like that. So we think we need, for all the reasons I've described and many more I haven't had a chance to talk about, a new biopolitics that would address all of these issues. And that's what we're trying to do. And got, I'm going to skip that slide. And we've got lots of stuff on our website that you can look at, and some of it you'll probably agree with, and some of it you'll probably disagree with, but I think this is the kind of conversation we need. So.
I work for Pacific Reproductive Services. Oh. And it's funny to see all this stuff. And for those who don't know, if you search for lesbian sperm bank in Google, you'll find them. But what is Viking sperm?
It turns out that there's this, is it Denmark, I guess, is the world's largest exporter of sperm. and
to Newport Beach, I would imagine.
People seem to, I mean, there are these kind of eugenic tendencies, as
Blonde,
even in
tall, blue-eyed.
Yeah, exactly, and the racial categories of is it a good idea that when we look at the catalogs of sperm donors and egg donors on websites that racial classifications are one of the primary ways that they're classified? And is this demand, or is this like imposing some kind of categorization scheme? So questions like that. But Viking sperm, there's big demand apparently for Viking sperm.
If I can,
even though the Nobel Sperm Bank didn't go anywhere.
So what I know, if I can, very quickly, what I know about lesbian couples is the woman who gets pregnant does not pick the donor. The woman who is her partner, who's not getting pregnant, picks a donor who looks like her, so that the child will be sort of in between the purchaser of the sperm and the woman who has the child. It's between the two partners. Which I thought you might think is interesting.
Yeah, no, I know people have done that, and I know people have done really different things. Someone has a friend, someone has
That's the
that's interesting.
We get,
yeah,
the main.
Yeah, it's funny that we should have that overlap.
How is there do you have an estimate of the amount, the number of surrogates per year, either by this country or globally? And then I'm interested in some of the other issues. Yeah,
there's no records that are kept anywhere, really. So there's just really guesstimate kind of stuff. So the Centers for Disease Control tracks the number of assisted reproductive technology cycles. That's the only regulation or policy that we have. But they don't track surrogate pregnancies. And in India, we have women's health advocates have done like a survey study, and they know that there are something like 3,000 fertility clinics, big ones, small ones, throughout India, but they're not sure, maybe one of them has done one surrogate birth and others have done literally hundreds. So hard to tell. And like in some countries where surrogacy is just emerging, like in one state in Mexico, by a quirk, it's permitted legally. Some law got put in the books in the 90s. And no one knows how many, maybe they're just being taken across the border. And women who are working as surrogates, they don't want anyone to know about it because they're getting money under the table. So, it's really a Wild West kind of situation.
I'm wondering how you deal with the question of the, I would say, maybe demanding parents. I have a friend who also wanted to adopt, and she went after this and after that and after that, and always the child was not perfectly fine. Yeah. And all the other people who just have children by normal birth have to take into consideration or have to take the child as it comes. But these people think because they can buy a child, that they can have the best quality. I also feel that there needs to be some policy. It starts with that everybody thinks they have to have a child. Nature isn't like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's wonderful that we can help some people who are infertile have children. with assisted reproduction. But when you get, I think there's two things that you have to think about. One is that when you're getting third parties involved, whether it's sperm providers or egg providers, and when you realize that there's a child or children who are coming into existence because of something that you did that's different than and more fraught, both biologically and socially, than sexual reproduction. So I think it really does introduce questions that we haven't had to deal with before, and we do have to deal with now.
So when I look at the material you presented, I think that there's a real issue around education and ethics, and you're really up against a considerable, I think, a real problem that the science moves forward and the capability that we have has moved forward, and yet we don't necessarily have a well-educated public in terms of really what's going on scientifically. Or really, I think it's in many cases a question of ethics when you talk about sort of this factory farming of babies and some of the other issues. Where do you see an improvement? Do you think education? Do you think ethics? Do you think that there is there's something that could be done in terms of making the public aware, or is it something that really is in the hands of legislation, or in many cases just business?
Well, there's a question and an off question there. Speaking of ethics, but the question of what's going on right now is that it is largely, for surrogacy particularly, it is largely in the hands of business. Some of it is these small entrepreneurs, startup kind of business, and some of it is driven by much larger interests, like the hormonal drugs that are used to stimulate the cycles and then suppress and then hyperstimulate the cycles of women who provide eggs and women who undergo IVF. This is a $4 billion a year industry. So there are significant financial interests involved. So that's where we're at now. And I think, what ought it to be? I think these technologies, like other powerful technologies, somehow have escaped our assumptions about what kinds of forces should be subject to democratic deliberation and influence. We think we should, have, it's messy, it's very imperfect, but we think we should have some kind of democratic processes when we think about who should be president, what kind of tax policy, what kind of education policy. But an audience like this knows more than many how powerful science and technology can be in shaping our everyday lives, in shaping broad social and political and economic dynamics. And somehow those questions about how should these technologies be developed? What should get priority? Are there lines that should be drawn? If so, what are they and where? We don't have a norm that those should be subject to social discussion, political debate discussion. This is why we think we need a new biopolitics, and we're trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? It's early, I think, in the development of this. We see some signs of it. I could tell you more about that, but it's really one of the things I feel very strongly about. It's really important that people who are scientists working in the sciences be part of it. And we have a tendency that it's hard to know how to navigate to focus on some of the less responsible, shall we say, scientific figures who say things because it makes our case that we need to have a discussion. But then that can also alienate other people who are scientists who I think, we won't agree on everything, but we want to be in close collaboration and conversation with. And I think scientists have a really important role to play. The scientists working in these biomedical fields and these genetics fields have really important, and the technologists who are working in the assisted reproduction sector and others have really important roles to play in sparking these conversations and figuring out what kind of policies are needed.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the conversation. You can chat with her separately because we have to be out of here by about 9:30 or so. So if you want to talk to the speaker.
Can I say thank you very much for your
work?